good day to all of you. Today we are going to learn about physiology of swallowing, which is a very important topic when you are considering your physiology of gastrointestinal system. Right. So what are we going to learn today? First we will deal what is swallowing, right? Then we will learn what are the stages of swallowing. And I will then touch on briefly about the regulation of swallowing. Swallowing or deglutition, simply saying, it is a complicated mechanism. Though it is a simple word, this is a very complicated mechanism because pharynx, which is a very common structure both to the respiration as well as swallowing, is involved mainly in the swallowing process. So we will see how this process is going to be complicated because of the involvement of pharynx. Okay. Right. So there are three stages of swallowing. Those are oral stage, second one is the pharyngeal stage, and the third one is the esophageal stage. Now, oral stage means you are pushing your food bolus from the oral cavity into the pharynx. And then the pharyngeal stage is you are having your food bolus in your pharynx. Then you push it into the esophagus. That is the pharyngeal stage, which is the most complicated stage among those three. And the esophageal stage is somewhat an easy process, easy one. That is, you are propelling the food bolus towards the stomach from the esophagus. Right. Now, oral stage is known as a voluntary stage. Why I'm saying this is a voluntary stage? Because you have a control upon this. You can control this oral stage. So when the food bolus is ready for swallowing, with the help of your tongue, that food bolus will be squeezed upward and backward against your soft palate with the movement of the tongue. So what is the direction? Upward and backward. It is rolled posteriorly and upward. And it is propelled towards your pharyngeal area. So this is the process where you are going to start with the swallowing process. So it is a voluntary stage. Here it is very important the pressure of the tongue upward and backward against the palate. And also remember there is another thing which is very important in this oral stage. That is your saliva. Saliva is important to make the food bolus. Okay. And also by making the food bolus, you are going to prevent the dispersion of the food particles here and there and aiding this process furthermore. And with the help of the saliva and the tongue movements, this oral stage will be completed. All right. Then you are moving towards your pharyngeal stage, which is an involuntary stage, and almost all the process of this pharyngeal stage will be a reflex process. It constitutes passage of food bolus through the pharynx into the esophagus. Right. Now, at the beginning of this lecture, I told you this is very complicated, this whole swallowing process because of this pharynx. Now we are going to deal with it. Okay. How it is going to be complicated. Now, you know, to simply, I am going to recall your memories. Now, there are regions of pharynx, no? There is nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx. There are three divisions of pharynx. So, when you are moving the food bolus into this oropharynx area, still you are having connections with the nasopharynx as well as the laryngopharynx. It's clear. So that means now when you see carefully, if you are pushing a food bolus from the oral cavity and it is lodging in the oropharynx area, there are four main openings, four main pathways that this food bolus can enter if you are not coordinating it properly. So by looking at this picture, you can guess what are the pathways. If the food bolus is here, what is the most quickest pathway it can enter? Either it can go into the laryngopharynx area. That means to the larynx and to the lungs. Okay. And then it can go back into the oral cavity. Or else it can go into the nasal cavity, upward and backward, that is through the nasopharynx area. And the last one is it can go and it can enter to the esophagus. So what is the pathway? Now we have to correctly choose when you are doing the swallowing process? This pathway, that is the esophageal pathway. That means you have to cut off or close off the laryngeal pathway. You have to close the oral pathway, oral cavity, and also you have to close the posterior nares and the nasal cavity. Otherwise, disastrous complications would occur, especially if it is going and lodging in the lungs or without going into the lungs. Actually, it can destroy. I mean, it can destroy or it can terminate your life. Okay, right. Then now pharynx, it divides into larynx and esophagus. So esophagus lies behind the larynx and larynx lies anteriorly. That is easy, right? Now, since the pharynx communicates with mouth, nose, larynx and esophagus, the footballers from the pharynx can enter to 4 pathways. So it's easy. Now you can understand that. So footballers is made to enter only to the esophagus due to various coordinated movements. How? Now, how this process is going to be coordinated? It is going to be coordinated by various kinds of movements. So what are these movements? We will see. So these are some of the movements. Soft palate can be raised, tongue will block the oropharynx, and epiglottis close off the glottis. These are the movements. Okay. And now if you say the pharyngeal stage, as the bolus of the food enters the posterior mouth and pharynx, it stimulates. I told you it is a reflex process, right? So it stimulates the epithelial swallowing receptor areas. What are these things? Epithelial swallowing receptor areas all around the opening of the pharynx, especially on the tonsillar pillars. Okay, so now when these epithelial swallowing receptor areas will send the signals to the swallowing center, impulses from going to the swallowing center in your brainstem, especially in the medulla oblongata, it will initiate a series of automatic pharyngeal muscle contractions. So what are these coordinated automatic pharyngeal muscular contractions? The first one is to prevent or to close your nasal cavity or the opening into the posterior nares. What is it? The soft palate movement. Soft palate, I have circled it here, is pulled upward and close the posterior nares to prevent reflux of food into the nasal cavities. Okay, that is the first one. Now look at these three. These three movements will close your larynx to prevent the footballers entering into your lungs. So what are these three movements now? Follow me carefully. The first one is vocal cords of the larynx are strongly approximated. And the second one is larynx will be pulled upward and anteriorly. It is pulled upward and anteriorly by the movement of the neck muscles. And then epiglottis will swing backward over the opening of the larynx. So three structures, three different mechanisms. But the ultimate effect is one, that is your laryngeal opening will be protected, right? So first one is vocal cord of the larynx will be approximated closely. Second one is your larynx is pulled upward and anteriorly by the neck muscles. And the third one is epiglottis will swing backward over the opening of the larynx. So all these 2, 3, 4 movements will prevent the passage of footballers entering into the larynx. Right. Now we are now we have closed 2 pathways, right? So what are these 2 pathways? The laryngeal opening and we have closed the posterior nares. Okay. Now we are safe, but still we have one more pathway to be closed. What is that? That is your oral cavity. So how the oral cavity? We are not going to completely shut it off, but anyhow, because of the position of the tongue against the soft palate, and because of the position, now we have already pushed it upward and backward to pull or propel the footballers into the pharynx. No. So by that movement, actually, the position of the tongue against the soft palate will make increase intraoral pressure. Okay. So it will prevent the footballers entering back into the mouth again because of the increased intraoral pressure. So tongue is the one which is responsible for that. Right. Now we are safe. We have closed all the dangerous three pathways. Now we have the esophageal opening very clearly open. Now we have to enlarge the opening, okay? And we have to mediate selective proper propelling of the food particles into the esophagus, okay? For that, there are some structures, right, which are going to be organized properly. The first one is there are some structures known as like vocal cords. There are known as palatopharyngeal folds on each side of the oropharynx. They will move medially. They will be pulled medially to approximate each other. Why? Because they will form a small slit when they are approximating each other. They are making a small sagittal slit through which the food must pass into the posterior pharynx. So what is the purpose of this slit? It performs a selective action, allowing the food that has been masticated or that has been chewed sufficiently to pass with ease. Can you understand that? That means if food particles are not properly being masticated, they are not going to be sent into the esophageal area. They will be selected without sending into the esophageal area. So that is the selective action done by the palatopharyngeal folds. And then now with the movement of now I told you to close the laryngeal opening, you are moving the larynx upward and anteriorly. By the upward movement of the larynx, simultaneously what will happen? Your esophageal opening will be enlarged. It is actually an indirect effect of the laryngeal movement. Okay. And at the same time, remember, upper 3 to 4 centimeters of the esophageal muscular wall, it is known as upper esophageal sphincter, or sometimes in some textbooks, it is mentioned as pharyngeal-esophageal sphincter. It will be relaxed. Okay. So the esophageal opening will be enlarged by the movement of the larynx, and then palatopharyngeal folds will be approximated together and forming a selective action by the means of a small sagittal slit formation. At the same time, your upper esophageal sphincter will be relaxed, and it will allow and accommodate the food bolus to be entered easily into your esophagus. Now you can understand that here the upper esophageal sphincter, and there's another part here, another small structure, that is the lower esophageal sphincter. So when you are dealing with the esophageal stage, we will talk about this lower esophageal sphincter. Now food is at the pharyngeal stage. You can see the upper esophageal sphincters are allowing, or they are relaxing and allowing the food bolus to be entered easily to the esophagus. Okay. Right. Now, I told you what will happen now with all these effects. Food bolus will be protectively, I use the word protectively, or it is very, smoothly will enter to the esophagus, because now we have closed all the dangerous three pathways, and which we have already created a nice smooth pathway in the esophageal area. Okay, right. So now then we are moving towards the esophageal stage. Now we have already finished the pharyngeal stage, right? Now we are moving toward the esophageal stage. Now we have some kinds of peristalsis movements within the pharyngeal stage. Okay, because now you are propelling the food bolus toward the esophagus. No, so at the end of the pharyngeal phase, how these food boluses will be propelled by the means of peristaltic movements. Remember, this entire process will take only less than within 2 seconds. So it's a very quick process. So with this one, now esophageal stage, primarily it is done to conduct food rapidly from the esophagus to the stomach. So there are some movements which are specifically organized for this function as well. They are known as peristalsis. So I told you at the end of the pharyngeal stage, we initiate the peristaltic movements. They will continue towards the esophageal stage as well, right? So now look at this. This is actually a small scenario how the peristaltic contraction will be there. So when the food bolus is there, from one side it will contract, while the other side it will relax, okay, in the esophageal area. Right. So now there are two types of peristaltic movements which can be seen in the esophageal stage. That is, the first one is the primary peristalsis. The second one is the secondary peristalsis. So primary peristalsis is now simply it is a continuation of the peristaltic waveforms which have already begun in the pharyngeal stage, okay, during the pharyngeal stage of swallowing. So it will move the food bolus into your esophagus, and then still your peristaltic movements will be continuing, right? Then you are moving towards your secondary peristaltic movements. If the primary peristaltic wave fails to move into the stomach, all the food which has already entered into the esophagus, what will happen? Secondary peristaltic waves will result. They will result from distension of the esophagus itself by the retained food. So it is actually happening only if the food bolus, the complete food bolus, will not empty into the stomach. So these waves continue until all the food has emptied into the stomach. How these secondary peristaltic waves will be formed? Right, we will see how the secondary peristaltic wave will be initiated in the last part of our lecture. That is, now we are going to learn about the nervous regulation of swallowing. Now, we have discussed about the stages of swallowing. If I were to summarize the whole lecture we have done so far. So what are the things we have learned? I told you swallowing is a very complicated mechanism because it is having a common pathway, pharynx, both to the swallowing process as well as to the respiration. And then secondly, we discussed this has three main stages: oral stage, pharyngeal stage, as well as your esophageal stage. Among these three stages, oral stage is the one which is voluntary. Other two stages are involuntary. Oral stage, we have two main things: pressure and the movement of the tongue, as well as the saliva, will be very important to function the oral stage. And then we are moving towards the pharyngeal stage. There we have lots of movements because we are involving our pharynx there. We have four pathways when you are considering the food bolus. It can enter either to larynx and the lungs, either to the esophagus and to the stomach, and then to the posterior nares back into your nasal cavity, or else it can enter to your oral cavity. So when the epithelial receptor centers, epithelial swallowing receptor areas around especially on the tonsillar pillars are going to be stimulated by the food bolus, they will send signals to your swallowing center in the brainstem. So then swallowing center will send so many impulses, effector signals to the pharyngeal muscle areas. As a result of that, what will happen? Lots of mechanisms, automatic contractions will occur. So laryngeal opening will be closed by the means of epiglottis and movement of the larynx, okay? And then vocal cords will be approximated. It is protected. Then you close your posterior nares by the movement of the upward movement of the soft palate. And then your oral cavity will not accept food bolus anymore because of from the pharynx backward because of the pressure of the tongue and increasing intraoral pressure. Now we are left with only the esophageal stage opening. And what will happen now? Esophageal opening will be more enlarged by the movement of the larynx, as well as you are having palatopharyngeal folds. They will approximate and making a small sagittal slit. It is performing a selective action for the food particles to be entered, which are properly being masticated. And then what will happen? You are now producing a nice smooth pathway. Your upper esophageal sphincter is going to be relaxed. Now you are propelling the food bolus to the pharynx. You have peristaltic movements as well in this stage. And now we are moving to the esophageal stage, which has two major movements. primary peristalsis and your secondary peristalsis. Primary peristalsis is actually a continuation of the pharyngeal peristalsis. If this fails to empty the food enough to the stomach, then the secondary peristaltic waves will occur. We will see who is going to regulate that process. Okay, right. Now we are going to the nervous regulation. Okay, now I told you oral stage is solely a voluntary stage, no? So we have some control on it. Now we have to learn about the nervous regulation of pharyngeal stage as well as the esophageal stage. Ready? Okay. So I told you earlier also, pharyngeal stage is actually an involuntary as well as solely a reflex act. It is almost always initiated by voluntary movement of the food into back of the mouth, and it is stimulating your epithelial swallowing receptor areas to elicit this swallowing reflex. So actually, if you talk about swallowing reflex, it starts at the pharynx. Remember that, okay? So who is the stimulus? What is the stimulus now for the pharyngeal stage or the swallowing reflex? When the food bolus enters the oropharyngeal region, the receptors present in this region, mainly on the tonsillar pillars, are stimulated. Then afferent fibers, who will carry the signals to your brainstem. Two cranial nerves are involved here. First one is the trigeminal nerve. The next one is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Okay. And you are going to your medulla oblongata. Why? There you have the medulla oblongata. One part of your brainstem has the swallowing center, which is in the floor of the fourth ventricle. Okay. Right. So here, after coordinating everything in the swallowing center, now it will send signals to your pharyngeal area, pharyngeal muscles, and all these muscles around this area through mainly 5 types of nerves. 4 cranial nerves are involved here: glossopharyngeal, 9th cranial nerve, vagus, 10th cranial nerve, and your trigeminal, that is the 5th cranial nerve, and the hypoglossal, that is the 12th cranial nerve, last one, and few superior cervical nerves. Okay, and they will go and reach your soft palate, your pharynx, your upper esophagus, lots of areas which we have already discussed. Okay, so you have to remember what are the afferent nerves, what are the efferent nerves, okay, and who are going to mediate these movements. So what is the response ultimately? This reflex causes all the effects occur in the pharyngeal stage. Okay, as we have described already, upward movement of the soft palate, upward movement of the larynx, and movement of the epiglottis, okay? And then your vocal cords movements, okay? Everything are being coordinated with the help of these signals, nerve signals, which are coming through these efferent nerves. Okay, so it is very easy now. Okay, receptors, now you should know trigeminal and glossopharyngeal nerves are the afferent nerves. They are going to the brainstem through the 5th, 9th, 10th, 12th cranial nerves, and few superior cervical nerves. You have to add this to here. Series of automatic pharyngeal muscle contractions would occur. Okay, with the help of the soft palate movement, laryngeal movement, vocal cord movements, everything, and your epiglottis movement. So that is simply the swallowing reflex. But you have to know the details, not this. This is only a summary. This slide shows you a summary. You should know the details. Right. So now we are moving towards the esophageal stage. Now I told you primary peristalsis is going to be controlled, or it is actually the continuation of the peristaltic waves which are originated in the pharynx. So secondary peristaltic waves are initiated by 2 things. Partly by the intrinsic neural circuits in the myenteric nervous system as a local nervous complex, right? You know, there are 2 types of local nervous plexuses within your smooth muscle, I mean the GI tract. What are those? Yes, this myenteric plexus and another one, right? So those 2 plexuses, nervous plexuses, are very important to control your movements as well as your secretions of the gastrointestinal tract. So myenteric nervous system is mainly involved with the movements of your gastrointestinal tract. So the myasthenic nervous system will partly responsible to initiate the secondary peristaltic waves, and then another one is vagal afferent fibers, right? So they will carry signals. Okay, now still we don't have enough strength to propel the footballers into the stomach. Please give some nervous signal. So then vagal afferent fibers to medulla, back again to the esophagus through the glossopharyngeal nerve, and the vagal efferent. Both will be involved as efferents as well, because only afferent will be carried through the vagus nerve, and that signals will be coming towards the esophagus, and secondary peristaltic waves will be initiated. So the first one is the myenteric local nervous system. The second one is through the central nervous control by the means of vagus and the glossopharyngeal with the help of your swallowing center. Okay, so ultimately what will happen, you will have nicely coordinated emptying of the food bolus into the stomach. Now with this actions, all these actions, now stomach is going to be ready to accept the food bolus. Okay, now as the food bolus or the peristaltic wave passes through this esophagus to the stomach, a wave of relaxation also precedes the peristalsis, which is going to be transmitted through the myenteric inhibitory neurons, precedes the peristalsis. That means entire stomach and maybe to a lesser extent the duodenum will be relaxed. Okay, that is known as, especially the stomach area will be relaxed, because to receive the food bolus which is coming from the esophagus, that process is known as receptive relaxation of the stomach. That is again very important phenomenon or the process which will occur at the end of the swallowing process. Right. Now here, there's another thing now. We have talked about the upper esophageal sphincter. No, there's another thing called lower esophageal sphincter. This is again known as gastroesophageal sphincter because it is at the junction of the gastrum or the stomach and the lower esophagus. So above the junction of the esophagus with the stomach, 3 centimeters usually remain tonically constricted. When the peristaltic movement, swallowing wave passes down the esophagus, what will happen? Receptive relaxation of the gastroesophageal sphincter will occur and allow the food go easily to the stomach. Okay? Sphincter does not relax satisfactorily. Now, suppose now for this process to be coordinated, to be done very smoothly, your lower esophageal sphincter should be nicely relaxed. But in some disease conditions, this sphincter does not relax satisfactorily. That case you called as what? Achalasia. Okay, you will learn when you are going to your clinical years. That is known as achalasia. Right. So this is how simply the oral cavity sphincter, how it is going to relax during the lower esophageal stage of swallowing. And why it is usually tonically contracted? Because it prevents stomach contents backflow into the esophagus. So it should be tonically contracted. Only when it has swallowing is there in the lower esophagus, it will relax. But then again, it is going to be contracted because it want to prevent the food bolus again back entering into the esophagus. So that is actually a very nice preventive mechanism. Right? So if it is too tightly, somehow, if it is too tightly closed at the time of swallowing, again, it is a problem. So it is the condition known as achalasia. Right. Now we have done all the physiological aspects of swallowing very clearly and in detail. Now we are moving towards the applied physiology. Now, why we learn swallowing process? Again, it is very important when you are learning the swallowing process for your physiological aspects, as well as it can apply into your clinical scenarios. Now, difficulty in swallowing. If you have any abnormality in swallowing, difficulty, we call it as dysphagia. I will just touch the names only. It can either due to a tumor, either due to a stricture, like long-term problems will cause strictures, and due to connective tissue disorders and so many things. And you can have diverticular hernias and neurological disorders, okay? You will have dysphagia. If you are having neurological disorders involving your brainstem specifically, you have this dysphagia. Right. And when you're talking about swallowing, another very important disease process is gastroesophageal reflux disease. GERD. If you take the first letters of these terms, gastroesophageal reflux disease, GERD. Some will say GORD, G-O-R-D, okay, because they use O instead of E here, esophageal part. So that is actually regurgitation of acidic gastric content through the esophagus. Now, I told you a little while ago, it will be prevented by the means of lower esophageal sphincter because it is tonically contracted. Now, you can understand if if this lower esophageal sphincter is not doing its function properly, that means contracted during the, without, when you are not having swallowing process, what will happen? Your contents within your stomach will backflow into the esophagus, which will result in gastroesophageal reflux disease. Okay, so you will feel heartburn because you are having acidic contents now. Dysphagia, okay. Chronically, if you are exposing this gastroesophageal reflux disease is there, you are exposing your esophagus into acidic contents. Isn't that so? Then, of course, you have strictures, cough, esophagitis because of inflammation, okay? And so this normal people, esophageal reflux is prevented by, the major one is the gastroesophageal or the lower esophageal sphincter, as well as another valve-like mechanism is there. Usually small portion of the esophagus which extend beneath the diaphragm. Before the opening into stomach, it acts as a valve. Again, it prevents contents going back into the esophagus. But if these mechanisms are going to be failed, somehow you will experience GERD. Then the last one is esophageal achalasia. I told you this is a neuromuscular disease which will not, that is actually as a result of not relaxing the lower esophageal sphincter at the end of the swallowing process. So it will cause accumulation of food substances in the esophagus and it will distend the lower esophagus, dilatation of the esophagus. So again, it is a neuromuscular disease. Right. Now we have finished the physiology of swallowing. We have done what is swallowing. We have learned what are the stages of swallowing. And we have summarized the nervous regulation, especially the pharyngeal stage. And we have learned the esophageal stage. We learned that swallowing center is the major coordinating center. And lots of efferent, afferent nerves we have discussed. And we have just learned the names and few things regarding the application of the swallowing process in the clinical context. Okay. So I hope that you have got something regarding swallowing, physiology of swallowing during this short period. So hope to see you again with a new lecture. Thank you so much. Goodbye.